I want to say a very heartfelt thank you to the congregation for this study and the annual nature of it. I love the study and have come to know you a little bit and love all of you. Appreciate all of the hard work that has gone into this study by all the brothers and sisters here. And I know everyone has worked hard, and you'll be tired when this week is over, but we really appreciate it, and I think it's a good thing for the Lord's church. I really think that probably nothing we have done in our brotherhood has helped as much as the preacher studies we've had for the last 50 or 60 years. Now, that's just my opinion. It might not be everybody's opinion, but anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, the Restorer's views on carnal warfare. Since our discussion in this session is entirely historical and only tangentially biblical, it seems appropriate to state clearly at the outset what I believe the Bible teaches about carnal warfare. The Scriptures teach that Christians may not serve in the military of any nation or participate in any war at any time, for any reason, in any way. Romans chapter 12, verses 19 through chapter 13, verse 7, and John 18, verse 36, and numerous other passages. Having said that, what did the Restorers think about participation in carnal warfare? Unfortunately, the answer is relatively complex. It is not possible to state an official position of the Restoration movement toward participation in carnal warfare for at least 5 reasons. First, the movement strongly adheres to the doctrine of congregational autonomy, which it believes is divinely ordained and clearly set forth in the New Testament. Second, the churches of the Restoration movement are firmly committed against any humanly written creed, manual, or discipline. Furthermore, 3, no one attitude has been identified with the movement historically. Every attitude toward war which has been expressed in Christendom has been reflected in some measure in Restoration heritage churches. A pacifist element has always been strong. This was especially true among early advocates, with the exception possibly of Walter Scott. The more famous early leaders were all pacifist. However, during the periods of national stress, a crusade spirit has consistently emerged from the shadows and found expression in the church. Fifth, a significant number in the movement have accepted the concept of a just war. So the early days leading up to the Mexican-American War, Alexander Campbell early made his pacifist convictions known from the very first issue of the Christian Baptist in 1823. In the 30s and 40s, he occasionally published articles in the Harbinger by and about the peace reformers. Barton Stone followed a similar tack in his Christian Messenger. As early as 1827, he coupled war and slavery as the greatest evils in the world. He, like other disciple leaders, was not deeply interested in the peace crusade in the years preceding the Mexican-American War, but was definitely in sympathy with its aims. This view was almost universal among disciples, but even at this early date, there was a significant gap between the leaders and the ordinary membership of the churches. For example, in his Texas Disciples, Colby Hall concludes that many church members were active in the Texas Revolution. The Mexican-American War of 1846. With the outbreak of war with Mexico in May 1846, the first real test of disciples' devotion to the principles of pacifism was triggered, and the first major discussion of the war question exploded in church periodicals. In November 1846, Campbell published a long pacifist treatise in the Harbinger, and immediately after hostilities broke out, Walter Scott urged, quote, feelings of forgiveness and compassion toward the Mexicans and counseled Christians to stay out of the war and promote peace councils. In 1847, he published another plea for his readers, quote, to use all their influence to bring the war to a close. This was published in the Christian Messenger. The caustic Benjamin U. Watkins, presaging Mark Twain's war prayer by almost 60 years, sarcastically remarked that it was a strange new method of praying for enemies, which implored that our most Christian cannon may tear the entrails out of thousands of Mexicans, that our most pious bombshells may dash to pieces thousands of women and children. Perhaps the most significant impact of the Mexican War was its ignition of the first Brotherhood-wide periodical debate on the war question. The Gospel Proclamation published monthly articles by George Powell and Benjamin U. Watkins for almost 2 years, beginning in December 1847. The debate was exhaustive, and it became apparent that among disciples, at any rate, the issue turned on whether or not some of the New Testament Christians were soldiers. Powell argued that some Christians were soldiers, like Cornelius, for example, and that conclusively proved that Christians could fight. Watkins countered that soldiers who became Christians would be required to resign from the military, just as any convert would be required to stop all of his sinful practices. A stalemate developed before the antagonist had written 2 articles. Between 1860 and 1870, many such debates were held, but they all followed more or less the pattern of the Powell-Watkins debate. As the stricken nation lumbered toward 1861 and its rendezvous with tragedy, the mind of disciples of Christ was unsettled and unsure, but probably most of the church's leaders were pacifist. And so we approached the Civil War. As 1860 dawned, 2 questions loomed in the minds of the leaders of the disciples. What should Christians do if war came, and what would be the impact of the great civil struggle upon the church? Through most of the 1860s, disciples' periodicals were shrouded in silence. But by 1861, the old policy of suppression of the controversial was abandoned, and editions of the church, one by one, editors of the church, one by one, published appeals for moderation. Above all, they urged that whatever course the nation might take, Christians should remain united. In sum, as the national crisis ripened in the early months of 1861, the disciples reacted chaotically. There were theoretical pacifists, practical neutralists, and militant Northern hawks and militant Southern hawks within the church. By the summer of 1861, it was impossible to tell which group was most numerous and most influential in the councils of the church. Nor was there more than a semblance of stability within the groups. Out of this ferment emerged the most important statement of neutrality by disciples' leaders in 1861. It was a circular signed by 14 of the outstanding preachers of Missouri, among whom was J.W. McGarvey. While the circular was not a pacifist statement per se, it urged neutrality in the strongest possible terms. Whatever we may think of the propriety of bearing arms in extreme emergencies, we certainly do not, by the New Testament, which is our only rule of discipline, justify ourselves in engaging in the fraternal strife now raging in our beloved country. The neutrals, however, by no means completely dominated the fervent behind-the-scenes activity. Walter Scott, who had counseled pacifism in response to the Mexican-American War, wrote a militant article supporting forcible preservation of the Union. Scott's old comrade of so many battles, Alexander Campbell, refused to publish it in his Harbinger. Scott's intense nationalism triumphed over his pacifism, and he could not believe that the great providentially prepared American nation should be destroyed without a battle. When the roar of cannons in Charleston Harbor signaled the onset of war, disciples reacted like other mainstream Protestants in America. Able-bodied men mustered into the army, made their ways to the battlefields, certain that they bore arms for a just and righteous cause on both the North and the South. Although there were exceptions, the rank and file of the disciples entered the fray, reflecting the sentiment of the section in which they lived. As for the leaders of the movement, a significant number maintained neutrality throughout the war. Resisting the impassioned calls to patriotism, they chose to stand for peace and just as firmly against war, particularly a war which jeopardized the health and unity of the church they loved and served. But not all the leaders and preachers were so motivated. Some were all about war, defending the Union or defending states' rights and the Southern way of life. In some, disciples' leaders marched to the sound of different drummers during the Civil War, and many refused to march at all. Let's see what they thought. Thomas M. Allen. Allen was a wealthy, refined, influential preacher in Missouri. He, along with McGarvey, signed the Missouri Manifesto, appealing to brethren to remain neutral and not participate in the war. He essayed to preach as though no war was in progress. His pacifism is reflected in a statement he penned in the Millennial Harbinger. I would sooner go to the grave being killed for not killing my brother than go to the tomb with my brother's blood on my hands. On a journey, thought you would find this interesting, to Columbia, Missouri, a soldier halted him asking if he were armed. Allen replied, yes, with the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. Edward Dickinson Baker is remembered as a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, one of Lincoln's sons was named after Baker. By profession, Baker was a lawyer, but he preached for churches on occasion. During the war, he served as a colonel in the Union Army, losing his life in the Battle of Ball's Bluff, Virginia. William Baxter distinguished himself as an educator and an author. He was a professor at Newton College in Mississippi, and from 1860 to 1863, he was president of Arkansas College in Fayetteville, Arkansas. He authored a book of poetry, a book called Pea Ridge and the Prairie Grove about the Civil War in Arkansas, and he also authored a biography of Walter Scott and another of Noel Shaw, the singing evangelist. Baxter remained neutral throughout the war and perhaps leaned toward pacifism. In his book about the war, he observes that rather than attempting to mitigate the horrors of war and to calm fierce passions, preachers often strove to augment one and inflame the other. Otis Asa Burgess was a chief polemicist of the movement and was decidedly of Northern sympathy.
Next slide.
Thank you. In 1862, on the Weekly Christian Record, he openly criticized McGarvey's pacifist position. D.S. Burnett was surrounded by an impressive circle of political and military acquaintances, yet amazingly maintained a pacifist stance throughout the war. To so thoroughly resist such influences indicates the strength and sincerity of his conviction. Alexander Campbell, who came to be undoubtedly the most capable, learned, and respected leader, scholar, and debater of the Restoration movement, was an outspoken, thoroughgoing, and consistent pacifist throughout his life. In the very first issue of the Christian Baptist, he wrote with impassioned irony. He said, "And stranger still, see that Christian general with his 10,000 soldiers and his chaplain at his elbow, preaching, as he says, the gospel of goodwill among men, and hear him exhort his general and his Christian warriors to go forth with the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other, to fight the battles of God and their country, praying that the Lord will cause them to fight valiantly and render their efforts successful in making as many orphans and widows as will afford sufficient opportunity for others to manifest the purity of their religion by taking care of them." In 1825, Campbell published with some zest a third epistle of Peter with its ironical but prescient advice to preachers. "If a brother shall raise up the banner of war against brother and Christians against Christians, rebuke them not, but be some of you on the one side and some on the other. Tell the one host that God is on their side, and the other host that he is on their side, and so make them bold to kill, and even among swords and lances let your black robes be seen. Preach ye not peace on earth and goodwill to men, but preach ye glory to the victor and victory to the brave." 25 years later, on May 11th, 1848, Campbell again set forth his views to a large gathering at the Lyceum in Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia. "Can Christ's kingdom or church in one nation wage war against his own kingdom or church in another nation?" Campbell answered this question in the negative in 8 points. If you're interested, I can summarize them for you later in the Q&A. His thesis was that war is utterly abhorrent to the gospel and incompatible with Christian character. The celebrated speech is still circulated by pacifists and was printed in the Congressional Record some 90 years later on November 22, 1937, at the request of the Honorable Joseph B. Shannon of Missouri. Still, a dozen years later, when the Civil War actually began, Campbell's indignation burned white hot. Civilized America, civilized United States, boasting of a humane and Christian paternity and fraternity, unsheathing your swords, discharging your cannon, boasting of your heathen brutality, gluttonously satiating your furious appetites for fraternal blood, caps the climax of all human inconsistencies inscribed on the blurred and moth-eaten pages of time in all its records. The editorial policy of the Millennial Harbinger was thoroughly pacifist, and from letters circulated and addresses published in its pages, it is evident that there was rather general support for this position, at least upon the part of most of the journal's correspondents. Campbell even refused to carry arms for self-defense. Once, while traveling in Ohio, he admitted to a stranger that his only weapon was a New Testament. "Sir," asked the stranger, "do you suppose that would defend you against robbers?" "Certainly much better than I could defend myself," replied Campbell. The author of this book has promised to preserve those that trust in him, and I know that he is much more able to protect me than I could protect myself. The sage of Bethany was consistent in his pacifism as any person of his time. T.W. Caskey. This veteran preacher of the South was among those who was commissioned to draw up Mississippi's document of secession. During the war, he carried a double-cylinder 16-shooter revolver and a Colt rifle, earning the reputation as the Fighting Parson. Early in the war, Caskey served as a chaplain of the 18th Mississippi Regiment of Volunteers. He tended to the sick, led prayer meetings, but when battle broke out, he would enter the fray. He confessed that the old Adam would overcome the new. "I would shoulder a gun and go into the fight. I do not think I killed anyone or broke any arms. but I tried to break as many legs as possible. If an enemy soldier's leg is broken, he explained, it takes 2 men to pack him off, and they take care not to come back till the fight is over. Alexander Chatterton was editor of The Evangelist, and as an outspoken pacifist, he asked, if the 12 apostles were dispersed throughout the United States, 6 in the north, 6 in the south, would they urge brethren to enter mortal combat? Jacob Creeth Jr., his name is conspicuously absent from the Missouri Manifesto urging pacifism. Although often requested, he declined to preach on the subject, feeling that each individual had to make up his own mind. Personally, he had nothing to do with the war and wanted nothing to do with it. At the beginning of the war, he felt that if guilt was to be assigned, it would rest with the government and not with any individual who answered the call to arms. Later, upon careful reflection, he began gradually to change his views to finally and independently reach conclusions very similar to those of David Lipscomb, and he wrote to Lipscomb commending his views. Isaac Errett, when the war began, McGarvey wrote Errett soliciting his help in keeping brethren out of the war. Errett refused McGarvey's solicitation. Isaac Errett was strongly anti-slavery and decidedly pro-Northern in his sentiment. He sought a commission in the Union Army as a colonel so that he might raise troops, and when his request was denied, he instead obtained a chaplain's commission. By 1863, the North had won control of the American Christian Missionary Society and had several periodicals under its direction. But leading Loyalist preachers were frustrated because Benjamin Franklin would not let them write in the pages of the American Christian Review. By 1865, James A. Garfield, the wealthy Phillips brothers of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and the ultra-loyalist John P. Robinson joined together to start the Christian Standard so that they could air their views on the duty of Christians to support the government in its war on rebellion, its duty to punish traitors, and the infamy of slavery. Isaac Errett was the editor of the Standard. Talbert Fanning was unquestionably the most influential preacher in the South before the war began, and in my estimation, was closer to our own ideology in general than any other restorer. He counseled Christians to have no part in the war. His anti-war views were made clear as early as 1845. He believed that war in every shape was opposed in all its bearings to the Christian religion. When war drums began to beat in earnest, he pleaded for the North and the South to settle their differences amicably by discussion. When hostilities erupted, Fanning met with David Lipscomb, E.G. Sewell, and P.B. Trimble, along with several other like-minded brethren at Beech Grove in Williamson County, Tennessee, to discuss how they might assist brethren in keeping out of the war. When Union forces seized Nashville, an oath of allegiance was required of all citizens. Apparently, Fanning was willing to declare himself loyal in the same secondary way he had been loyal to the Confederacy, that is, a good but uninvolved citizen, first loyal to God and the kingdom of Christ. But this declaration was unsatisfactory and classed as disloyalty. Because of his, quote, disloyalty, he was not paid for honest labor, which he performed, and his possessions were confiscated and burned. At times, Fanning was destitute of food. His pacifism was forged by several considerations. To violently shed blood was contrary to the pattern of gentleness left by Christ. He drew support from the fact that early Christians yielded to unjust martyrdom rather than inflicting vengeance. The fact that there were Christians on both sides also influenced Fanning's thinking, and also he could not imagine how Christians who engaged in the violence of war could afterwards preach the gospel of peace. But the most compelling argument shaping Fanning's view was his attitude toward civil affairs in general. For him, the kingdom of God demanded full-time citizenship, which eliminated citizenship in any earthly kingdom. All that Christians could do for the world was to be done through the church. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most widely known and respected preachers of his day. His reputation was largely derived from his connection with the religious press. He was the editor of the American Christian Review, the most widely known and read Restoration paper. Franklin was a thoroughgoing, avowed pacifist who undoubtedly influenced many brethren to adopt his views. In the American Christian Review, he expressed these sentiments early on in the Brotherhood-wide war discussions. Quote, "We cannot always tell what we will or will not do. There is one thing, however, things may turn out, or whatever may come, that we will not do. And that is, we will not take up arms against and fight and kill brethren we have labored 20 years to bring into the kingdom of God. Property may be destroyed, safety may be endangered, or life lost, but we are under Christ, and we will not kill or encourage others to kill or fight the brethren." With fervent appeals, Franklin urged preachers not to turn their pulpits into political harangues, but to continue to point people to the one great peacemaker, Jesus Christ. When the war began, Franklin was a staunch and vocal defender of the American Christian Missionary Society. But by the time Garfield, Robinson, and Errett had captured control of the society and passed a war resolution in 1863, making it a vocal defender and advocate of the Union military forces, Franklin turned against it with all the influence he had. The gap between the American Christian Review and the Standard widened until there was no fellowship between them and their readerships. On the other hand, when the war ended, Franklin thought the subject should be dropped and that the focus should be shifted to preserving the unity of the brotherhood. He did not appreciate Lipscomb's unwillingness to let matters settle down. Franklin was annoyed with Lipscomb and the Gospel Advocate and all of Lipscomb's civil government articles. After the war, Franklin tried to steer the American Christian Review in a middle-of-the-road path between the Gospel Advocate and the Standard. James A. Garfield. Garfield was an active supporter of the war from the beginning. He petitioned Governor Dennison of Ohio for a military appointment and received a commission as colonel and commander of the 42nd Ohio Regiment. He delivered, among many recruitment speeches, on the steps of disciple churches across the Western Reserve. In 1861, at a meeting of the American Christian Missionary Society, he spoke in favor of Dr. J.P. Johnson's war resolution calling for loyalty to the Union. Elijah Goodwin, as editor of the Christian Record, Elijah Goodwin espoused the Northern cause and followed the activities of Christians in the federal armies. The journal mercilessly assailed any Christian who spoke openly against the federal cause. He called upon his Northern brethren to put down the rebellion peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must. B.F. Hall. When war broke out, he aligned himself with the Confederate cause, serving as the chaplain for a regiment of Texas Rangers commanded by Barton W. Stone, Jr. He carried a splendid rifle, which he desired to use against the Yankees. War brutalized this brother's spirit. Hall advocated catching every Yankee soldier, cutting off their right hands, sending them back home with a hand tied to the saddle. A brother Graham asked him how he could feel this way toward his brethren in the North. And Hall replied, "I don't have any brethren in the North. They're all infidels." Hall's thirst for violence and his vituperative spirit restricted his capability of service after the Civil War, though he did return to Texas and he did preach. A.I. Hobbs of Indianapolis. Hobbs assumed responsibility for recruiting the 40th Regiment of Indiana Volunteers. One had to be a member of some church to join this regiment, and a number of Church of Christ members joined and formed the Christian Soldiers Society, and they conducted services every night during the war. Winthrop H. Hobson, when the war began, he was a minister of a congregation in Lexington, Kentucky. The congregation was torn in its sympathies and was at the point of dividing over slavery. Hobson believed he had aggravated the situation by being too open in his Southern sympathies, and he resigned in 1862 and urged the politically neutral J.W. McGarvey to take his place. Hobson joined the Confederate Gray as a chaplain under General John Morgan of Morgan's Raiders. B.W. Johnson of People's New Testament fame, he was one of the few leading Restoration preachers who believed Christians could participate in war. His opinion rested on a conviction that if it was right for a government to exist, it was right for that government to defend itself. But one could not describe him as an ardent war advocate, for his article began, "I deplore war. I regard it as a monstrous evil, but in this wicked world, sometimes it becomes a necessary evil, sometimes it is the only pathway to peace." Moses Lord, one of the longest and, in my opinion, best articles to appear in a Restoration journal on the subject of Christians engaging in warfare, was written by Moses Lard and can still be read in Volume 3 of Lard's Quarterly. His thesis was that under no circumstances does Christ permit his disciples to go to war. Lard developed his defense of pacifism in 7 points. I can give you a summary later if you want it. He concludes, if the state arrests the Christian and punish him for refusing to go to war, be it so. If the state even shoot him, be it so. Never let him go to war. Lard lamented that so many had rejected the wise counsel of the Venerable A. Campbell, who also was a pacifist. Lard's article merits scrutiny even today because it so effectively lays down the case for pacifism and answers several key anti-pacifist arguments. When the war began, T.B. Larrymore joined the Confederate Army. He was not yet a member of the Church of Christ, but he did not change his non-pacifist persuasion when he was baptized in 1864. This brings us to David Lipscomb, the most thoroughgoing pacifist of all Restoration leaders. David Lipscomb faced the war determined to stay aloof from it as far as possible. His preaching on the eve of the war largely emphasized what he considered to be the duty of all Christians, that is, to have nothing whatever to do with the war. As Lipscomb continued to preach that Christians should stay aloof from the struggle, word came to General Nathan B. Forrest while he was garrisoned at Columbia, Tennessee, that Lipscomb was preaching a doctrine disloyal to the South. He sent a staff officer to hear Lipscomb preach his sermon. The officer sat in a front seat and listened carefully as Lipscomb unfolded his views on the Christian's relation to civil government. During the sermon, the officer was moved to tears several times. Afterwards, he said to Lipscomb, "I have not yet reached a conclusion as to whether or not the doctrine of the sermon is loyal to the Southern Confederacy. But I am profoundly convinced that it is loyal to the Christian religion." After the war was over, all of the Restoration periodicals were ready to drop the discussion about war and whether or not Christians should be involved in it. But to the great annoyance of Isaac Errett and the Christian Standard and Benjamin Franklin of the American Christian Review, Lipscomb was not about to let the subject drop. He announced in the prospectus of the Gospel Advocate his intention to investigate the question of the relation which the church should sustain with civil government. And slowly, methodically, he developed his views one step at a time, and the issue filled the pages of the Gospel Advocate in almost every issue in 1866 and 1867. In 1889, these articles were compiled and published in a book called Civil Government. That book was reprinted by Linwood in 1984. In the book, Lipscomb disavows all active participation in civil affairs, including voting. Human governments, owing their origin to man's rebellion against God, were not proper spheres for Christian involvement. And of course, based on that framework, Lipscomb believed that no Christian should engage in war. Lipscomb's views were widely received throughout the South and in his lifetime and that of his students at the old Nashville Bible School. Still, it would be incorrect to say that the majority of the members of the churches of Christ at large at any time subscribed to his views, though probably most in our fellowship do and always have taken his views to heart. In 1891, when McGarvey set forth his own views at the Missouri Christian Lectureship, which were similar to Lipscomb's views, though not as stringent, McGarvey responded to questions about Lipscomb's views by saying, "I don't agree with Brother Lipscomb, but I don't know how to answer him." J.W. McGarvey exemplified a very strong pacifist sentiment within the church during the Civil War. 4 days after Fort Sumter was fired upon, he penned these words in a letter: "I know not what cause other preachers are going to pursue, but my own duty is now clear, and my policy is fixed. I shall vote when called upon according to my views of political policy, and whether I remain a citizen of the Union or become a citizen of the Confederacy, my feelings toward my brethren everywhere shall know no change. In the meantime, if the demon of war is loosed in the land, I shall proclaim to my brethren the peaceable commandments of my Savior and strain every nerve to prevent them from joining any sort of military company or making any warlike preparations at all. I know this course will be unpopular, but I would rather 10,000 times be killed for refusing to fight than to fall in battle or to come home victorious with the blood of my brethren on my hands." McGarvey's stand was not favorably received by all the brotherhood, but throughout the war he never wavered, nor did he hesitate to speak in behalf of pacifism. He delivered a major speech during the 1862 American Christian Missionary Society meeting, which referred to the war and its effects on the church. But a storm of human passion, seldom equaled in the history of our sinful world, is raging around us, and we have caught the infection. Many brethren have been swept into hopeless apostasy. The zeal of many has been killed. Distrust prevails among many who were once bosom friends. The evangelical labors of all have been much contracted. Churches languish, congregations dwindle. There is fear that such divisions have distracted the religious sects of the day, may yet disgrace our history. These unhappy results are undoubtedly attributable to too great sympathy with the passions and conflicts of the world. Notwithstanding these discouragements, we have unabated confidence in that hand which overrides the storm, and believe that all will redound to the glory of God and to the advancement of his cause on earth. Robert Milligan, J.W. McGarvey, wrote of him that he was preeminently a man of peace, scrupulously abiding by the precept to live peaceably with all men. Milligan satisfied his conscience by avoiding participation in the war. W.T. Moore, many scholars credit W.T. Moore of Frankfort, Kentucky, with saving Kentucky for the Union in 1861. Frankfort was the capital of Kentucky, and the governor, Beriah McGuffin, favored armed neutrality, which in all practical purposes meant secession. A survey was taken of the legislature about a week before they were to vote on whether or not to secede, and the legislators were equally divided, except for 5 or 6 undecided voters. At this junction, Moore announced his intention to preach on Sunday 2 days before the vote about secession on the duty of Christians in the present crisis. 5 of the 6 undecided men were members of Moore's congregation. They and about 40 or 50 other legislators attended on Sunday. Moore's sermon was based more on his religious views than on any political bias he may have had. His main concern was that in secession and its ensuing war, Christian brethren on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line would be fighting a war against one another. When the vote was taken, the governor's armed neutrality measure favoring secession was defeated. Many considered Moore's sermon as a deciding factor in saving Kentucky for the Union. This may be overstating the effect of Moore's sermon, but in view of J.H. Garrison's citation of this in the chapter entitled The Turbulent Period in his book, The Reformation of the 19th Century, and Moore's statement of approval of Benjamin Franklin's opposition to war in his living pulpit of the Christian Church, and his endorsement of the Missouri Manifesto in the same book, it seems evident that Moore opposed and remained aloof from the Civil War. Philip W.K. Pendleton, like his famed father-in-law, found abhorrent the thought of Christians going to war. In 1861, he made an eloquent appeal in The Harbinger against it. He said, "Let not 2 Christian souls perishing by mutual violence going down to death, frantic with the rage of mortal combat, hope to rise to the climes of celestial peace from such a struggle." Dr. L.L. Pinkerton, whose claim to infamy was that he was the man who introduced instrumental music into the worship of the church in Frankfort, Kentucky, served in the war on the Union side. Robert Richardson, another son-in-law of Campbell and author of the Memoirs of Campbell, steadfastly opposed the unhappy contest and advised against engagement in it. However, his son David died in 1864 as a member of Morgan's Raiders, led by General John H. Morgan. And on a side note to that, Alexander Campbell's son, A.C. Jr., and Barton W. Stone's son wore Confederate gray. John Shackelford, about the time of Moses Lard's article that opposed Christians going to the war, wrote an article defending Christians going to war. Lard graciously agreed to publish it. Shackelford's 2 major points in favor of Christians going to war centered upon Romans 13 and the concept of a legitimate or just war. However, Shackelford's true colors shone forth in his service in the Home Guards. Every time he heard that Morgan's Raiders were nearby, he grabbed his gun, went out to fight. He hoped to get a shot at W.H. Hobson, the preacher, riding with the Raiders. And then John Vaughter, there's Shackelford. John Vaughter was a prominent preacher in Iowa. He fought for the Union. So, you can just stop me when you want to. I've got about 5 minutes extra probably. According to David Edwin Harrell, the only pocket of disciples' pacifism to survive the Civil War was the theological conservatives of the Upper South. While the leadership of the church had been overwhelmingly pacifist prior to 1860, the church members in both the North and the South acted patriotically once the war began. When the war ended, most National Disciples leaders hoped that the Southern pacifists would not press the issue until tempers had cooled. Franklin counseled Lipscomb to wait 25 years before writing on this. Lipscomb had no intention of doing that. In 1865, Lard said he was going to write on it, but after appeals, he changed his mind. The war issue could not be so easily quashed, however. Many disciples who had participated in war, believing it to be a righteous cause, felt no sense of remorse or guilt and were irritated by pacifist self-righteousness, and furthermore, anger at rebels was still hot. On the other hand, pacifists, many of whom had suffered indignities during the war, were chafing to reprimand those who had participated in the war craze. In 1866, Lipscomb launched a withering attack on the Christian Standard and Isaac Errett as symbols of the Northern war spirit. Errett, who generally adopted a moderate cause after the war, though he continued to reject doctrinaire pacifism, responded Lipscomb's view was sour grapes because the South lost the war. In the meantime, the mainstream of the church had now come full circle. The peace movement became increasingly popular. Outright defenses of war were seldom published in Restoration journals until the late 1890s. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1812, disciples' journals generally called for arbitration rather than war. The editor of the Christian Standard said international arbitration should supersede the barbarous custom of human slaughter on the battlefield. Sympathy with peace reformers and those in favor of arbitration over war gradually increased for 3 decades after Appomattox, and crested in 1893 with a resolution passed by the American Christian Missionary Society encouraging world leaders to work for peace throughout the world. A similar peace initiative resolution was passed in 1895. In the 1896 Venezuelan boundary dispute, faith in international arbitration was high among disciples. But as the American feud with Spain increased in intensity, the ardor for peace cooled quickly. First, the 2 major motivations for peace in the Venezuelan problem were absent in the feud with Spain: Protestant manifest destiny and Anglo-Saxon racism. And as early as 1895, editorials about Spain and her cruel treatment of Cuba and its people became more and more aggressive. I'm 2 or 3 slides behind, sorry. The Spanish-American War. When the war was declared, disciples' papers, almost without exception, were as bellicose as the secular press in America. The challenge of war was exciting and contagious. Arguments for peace were easily cast aside in the, quote, emergency. Disciples' leaders gushed rationalizations for Christian war on the Spanish. From churches throughout the land, young men filed off to war with the prayers of the saints on their behalf. The church press actively urged all Christians to help carry the load of battle. Will there be any laggard Christian soldiers, asked James H. Garrison, who will refuse to join this missionary crusade for God, home, and native land? Of course, the war fervor of 1898 was the severest test of the pacifists in the late 19th century. Conservative Southern disciples stood by their principles once again. Lipscomb republished his article asking for conscientious objector status. The conservatives caustically attacked the liberal moderate disciples who gingerly discarded their peace platform. Could quote several there. Christian militants of 1898 felt compelled to justify their stance in favor of war. James H. Garrison said, "No war is justifiable that is avoidable. But no war is avoidable when the failure to engage in it involves national dishonor and violation of our obligations to our fellow man." In short, the just war defense was revived. They said the war with Spain is a war that looks to peace and as such is not only justified, but demands the overruling guidance of the God of battles. So I'll stop there. But obviously the restorers were inconsistent. They were all for peace when the nation was at peace. But many of them were for war when the nation was at war, and this went back and forth through the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War. And only the conservatives of the Upper South maintained a consistent view of pacifism. In 1899, everybody was ready for peace, and the church papers said that all Christians should be for peace.